There is one truth about you they didn't understand when they walked away. Not because you hid it, not because you failed to show it, but because some truths can only be recognized in absence. When they left, they thought they were choosing freedom, relief, something easier, something lighter. What they didn't realize is that they were walking away from something rare, a presence that doesn't announce itself, a depth that doesn't beg to be seen, a value that only becomes obvious after it's gone. This is the mistake many people make. They judge worth while standing inside it. They only understand value once silence replaces it. The truth about you is not loud. It doesn't chase. It doesn't prove. It doesn't demand recognition. And that is exactly why it haunts them later. You were not just someone who cared. You were someone who stayed consistent. Someone who showed up without keeping score. Someone whose presence felt steady, grounding, real. At the time, it felt ordinary to them, familiar, predictable, and predictable things are often mistaken for replaceable ones. Only later do they realize the difference between availability and depth. They remember the way you listened without interrupting, the way you understood without forcing explanation, the way you offered emotional safety without control. You didn't create chaos. You didn't keep them guessing. You didn't play games. And in a world addicted to intensity, calm is often misunderstood as lack of value. But calm is not emptiness. Calm is strength without noise. When they left, they thought they were losing comfort. What they actually lost was emotional alignment. And this is where regret begins. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly. It starts when they meet others who are exciting but inconsistent, charming but unreliable, present one day, absent the next. That's when memory becomes sharp. They begin to compare, not consciously at first, but emotionally. They notice what's missing, what no one else quite provides. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. Because the truth about you is this: you were not someone who tried to be unforgettable. You were someone whose value was felt over time. And time is exactly what reveals the mistake they made. Your value wasn't invisible because it was small. It was invisible because it was stable. People often don't recognize stability while they're inside it. They get used to it. They lean on it without noticing the weight it carries. They confuse reliability with predictability, and predictability with boredom. You didn't create emotional chaos. You didn't disappear to be chased. You didn't threaten leaving to be valued. You stayed consistent, and consistency doesn't scream for attention. It quietly supports everything around it. While you were there, your presence felt like the ground beneath their feet. Solid, dependable, always there. And like the ground, it was only noticed when it was no longer beneath them. Another reason they didn't see your value is because you didn't attach your worth to demand. You didn't force appreciation. You didn't require constant reassurance. You didn't keep score. That made it easy to assume you would always be there. People often mistake patience for permanence. They assume the one who understands will keep understanding. The one who forgives will keep forgiving. The one who stays calm will keep absorbing emotional weight. Until one day, that presence is gone. And suddenly, silence replaces support. This is when contrast begins to work against them. They start noticing how much effort it takes to explain themselves to others. How often they feel misunderstood. How shallow some connections feel compared to what they had. They realize something painful. You didn't just offer affection. You offered emotional clarity. You made things easier to carry. You listened without turning everything into an argument. You offered honesty without cruelty. You gave space without abandoning. That kind of balance is rare. But rare things aren't always recognized in real time. They're recognized in comparison. Only after leaving do they understand the difference between attention and presence, between excitement and emotional safety. And this is where regret quietly takes root. Not because they want you back immediately, but because they begin to understand that what you gave cannot be easily replaced. Regret doesn't begin the day they leave. That's a common misunderstanding. At first, they feel relief, lightness, possibility. They tell themselves they made the right choice. They focus on what felt heavy, not on what held them together. Regret begins later, quietly, without announcement. It begins when novelty wears off, when new attention stops feeling meaningful, when excitement fades and something deeper is required. This is the moment life starts asking questions they can't avoid. Who really understands me? Who stays present when things aren't easy? Who offers steadiness instead of stimulation? That's when memory shifts. They don't miss the surface things. They miss how they felt with you. Safe, seen, grounded. They remember how conversations didn't need to be defended, how silence didn't feel threatening, how disagreements didn't turn into power struggles. And now, without you, everything feels louder, heavier, more effortful. Regret grows when they notice how often they feel misunderstood, how often they have to explain themselves, how quickly connections become transactional instead of meaningful. They begin comparing, sometimes unconsciously, not your face, not your voice, your presence, that calm strength you carried, that emotional steadiness you offered without control, that patience you gave without making them feel small. They realize something too late. You didn't make life exciting. You made life livable. And livable doesn't sound romantic until it's gone. This is when regret stops being about missing you and becomes about missing who they were with you. Because with you, they were less guarded, less defensive, more honest. Without you, they feel exposed, restless, unsettled. And this is the truth most people don't admit. They don't regret leaving because you were perfect. They regret leaving because you were real. And real is rare. The truth that makes them regret leaving isn't what you did for them. It's who you were while doing it. You didn't lose yourself to be loved. You didn't shrink to be kept. You didn't beg to be chosen. You showed up as yourself, steady, present, emotionally available, without demanding recognition. And that is the part they underestimated. They thought your strength meant you'd move on easily. They thought your calm meant you didn't feel deeply. They thought your patience meant you didn't know your worth. They were wrong. Your strength wasn't emotional absence. It was emotional regulation. Your calm wasn't indifference. It was inner security. Your patience wasn't weakness. It was self-respect. And people often confuse self-respect with disposability until they realize it means you don't replace easily. This is the truth that settles in later. You were not attached to outcomes. You were attached to integrity. You gave without controlling. You cared without trapping. You loved without needing to win. That kind of presence doesn't create dependency. It creates emotional safety. And emotional safety is invisible until it's gone. They begin to notice how guarded they feel with others, how conversations feel performative, how connection feels conditional. They realize something painful. With you, they didn't have to be on edge. They didn't have to impress. They didn't have to protect themselves constantly. You offered a space where they could just exist. That's the truth they didn't see while you were there. You weren't loud enough to be dramatic. You weren't unstable enough to be addictive. You weren't chaotic enough to feel exciting. But you were anchoring, and anchors are only noticed during storms. This is why the regret doesn't fade quickly. Because they don't miss attention. They miss alignment. They miss the version of themselves that existed in your presence. And that loss is not external. It's internal. When regret finally settles in, most people don't express it. Not openly, not honestly. They carry it quietly. Admitting regret would require admitting something harder, that they misjudged value while it was present, that they walked away from something rare, that they confused calm with boredom and depth with familiarity. That's not easy to face. So instead of speaking, they go silent. They watch from a distance. They check in indirectly. They ask about you through others. They wonder how you're doing without asking directly. Because saying, "I was wrong," means confronting the truth that the loss was not mutual. It means accepting that what you offered cannot simply be found again. Another reason they stay silent is pride. Pride protects the ego from discomfort. It tells them it's better to appear detached than to admit they miscalculated. So they tell themselves stories. That timing was wrong. That circumstances were difficult. That things wouldn't have worked anyway. But beneath those explanations is a quieter realization. You were solid in a way they weren't ready to value. They also hesitate because they sense something important. You didn't collapse after they left. You didn't chase. You didn't beg. You didn't perform pain to be noticed. You remained yourself. And that makes regret heavier. Because if you had broken down, if you had pleaded, if you had stayed emotionally stuck, they could tell themselves you needed them. But you didn't. Your composure sends a message without words. I knew my worth even when you didn't. And that realization is uncomfortable. So instead of reaching out, they stay quiet. Instead of apologizing, they observe. Instead of reopening the door, they sit with the understanding that some doors close without drama, but never without consequence. This is why regret often lives in silence. Not because it's weak, but because it's too honest to be spoken easily. The moment they realize you're doing well without them, something shifts. Not because they want you back, but because the story they told themselves begins to fall apart. They assumed your strength depended on their presence. They believed your calm existed because they were there to receive it. They thought leaving would weaken you. Instead, you grew quieter, clearer, more rooted, and that unsettles them. Because growth without bitterness signals something rare. You didn't lose yourself in the connection. You were already whole. When they see you moving forward without resentment, without performance, it forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. You were not an extension of them. You were a separate, stable presence who chose to share space. That choice mattered. And once it was withdrawn, they felt the absence not as rejection, but as reality. They notice how you no longer reach out, how you no longer explain yourself, how your energy feels complete, not closed. That's when regret deepens. Not as longing, but as recognition. They realize something they can't undo. You didn't need to prove your value. Your life itself became the evidence. And here's the part most people miss. Your growth doesn't make them feel replaced. It makes them feel exposed. Exposed to the fact that what they left wasn't dependent, unstable, or fragile. It was grounded. And grounded people don't chase closure. They also begin to understand why connection with others feels different now. More effort, more uncertainty, more emotional noise. Because what you offered wasn't intensity. It was consistency. And consistency becomes visible only when it's no longer there. At this stage, many people feel an urge to reach out, not to return, but to relieve the discomfort of knowing they misread something meaningful. Most resist, because reaching out would confirm what they already know. So they stay silent. And the regret settles in deeper, not dramatic, not loud, just steady. Love can fade when it is built on need, excitement, or illusion. Regret doesn't, because regret isn't emotional attachment. It's self-recognition. What stays with them is not the memory of affection, but the realization that they walked away from a rare kind of presence. You didn't create emotional highs and lows. You created stability. And stability doesn't burn brightly. It illuminates slowly. That's why it's often overlooked at first and deeply missed later. They realized the loss wasn't dramatic enough to notice immediately. It didn't come with chaos or conflict. It came with quiet absence. And quiet absence echoes. The regret lasts because it's tied to a version of themselves that no longer exists. With you, they were calmer, more open, less defensive, more authentic. When they lost you, they didn't just lose a person. They lost access to that version of themselves. And that's not something time easily erases. This is why they compare future connections to something they can't fully name. Why nothing feels quite as grounding. Why something always feels slightly off. Not because others aren't good enough, but because alignment cannot be recreated on demand. Here is the truth that matters for you. Their regret is not your responsibility. Your growth was not a message. Your silence was not a lesson. You didn't thrive to be missed. You thrived because staying whole mattered more than being chosen. And that is why the regret remains with them, while peace remains with you. Some people teach us love. Others teach us clarity. And the rare ones, the ones like you, teach us what quiet strength looks like. Not everyone recognizes it in time, but those who don't never forget it.